right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Wow, it's a really packed room. So welcome to this morning session. I have called you Friends, Beauty, Imagination, and the Inklings. I hope you're at the right place. I'm the moderator, Richard Kim, for this session. And so we have three talks. First by Professor Ben Reinhard of Franciscan University of Steubenville. Also next is Professor John Balsbaugh. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Professor of Hillsdale College. And next, third, we have Professor Siobhan Maloney Latar of Trinity School at Meadow. And so each talk will be 18 to 20 minutes long, and we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A, which I'll help moderate. And okay, so first we have, our first talk is by Professor Ben Reinhard, and he will be speaking on J.R.R. Tolkien and liturgical imagination.
Thank you, Richard. My talk this morning has three relatively simple aims. My goal is to explain what I mean when I say the words liturgical imagination, to make the case biographically and intellectually that Tolkien is a strong candidate for having a liturgical imagination, and finally to give some sense of how a liturgical imagination is expressed and reflected in his imaginative works. But let's begin by considering Tolkien's most famous statement on the relationship of his faith and his fictional world. Quote, "The Lord of the Rings is of course a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. The religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism." These words have been quoted, as far as I can tell, in every sustained treatment of Tolkien in Catholicism. It is therefore regrettable that critics have paid so little attention to what Tolkien actually said. As Karl Hosstetter has recently pointed out, generations of critics have treated fundamentally as, quote, merely a throwaway rhetorical intensifier, as though it were a synonym of quite or thoroughly or really, when in reality, of course, it refers to a thing's foundations. Similar confusion seems to have attended the words religious and Catholic as well. Like fundamentally, these words have been left vaguely defined, if defined at all, and so Tolkien's work has been interpreted in an almost bewildering number of ways, as Augustinian or Thomistic or Numenian, or in conversation with larger Catholic literary revivals, or as a representative of Christian humanism. Now, I need to stress that there's nothing wrong with approaches like this. Studies like this have greatly increased our understanding and appreciation of the man and his work. But I still need to point out that sharing points of contact with this or that Catholic thinker is not enough to make a work fundamentally religious and Catholic. Today, I hope to advance an alternative to the scattered views that dominate discussions of Tolkien's Catholicism and to offer a paradigm that might help to unify them. To do so, let's note, strictly speaking, to be religious is to participate in the virtue of religion, which, according to the classic definition, consists in offering service and ceremonial rites to a superior. To be Catholic and religious is to offer those services and rites in the manner prescribed by the Catholic Church, which is through liturgical prayer. In other words, Tolkien's works are most profitably read as products of a specifically liturgical imagination. Before going any further, we need to attempt to understand what is meant by the term liturgical imagination. I draw the term from the writings of Philip Marais and Conrad Pepler, Tolkien's contemporaries, fellow Englishmen. We begin with Marais, the Swiss-English farmer, journalist, psychologist, and very many other things, who explored the concept of Christian imagination in J.H. Oldham's Real Life is Meeting. Marais grounds his discussion of imagination in a broadly Thomistic understanding of the term. The imagination is a storehouse of images, what Marais calls etherealized sensations, that forms the backdrop of our daily experience. But Marais gives more weight to the imagination than is usual in neo-scholastic discussions of the faculty. For Marais, the imagination largely bounds what we are able to think, desire, and create. Indeed, imagination can, quote, control a person whether he knows it or not. Imagination is, after its own fashion, doing our thinking and willing for us, in each moment that we cease consciously to think or to will. Because of this formative power, Murray observes that it's only natural that every great religion has sought to form the imaginations of its adherents through, quote, public worship and ceremonial, which he describes as the liturgical reenacting of its central mythos. But what is true of every religion is especially true of Christianity, as its, quote, sacred mythos is also real history. Because the gospel drama really happened, it can affect the minds that receive it at deeper as well as higher levels of consciousness than the intellectual. It may influence the levels at which we dream. Thus, Murray suggests that the imagination can be molded until it habitually and unconsciously recreates liturgical patterns in the mind. A few years later, Father Conrad Peppler, English Dominican, family friend of Murray, took what was implicit in the original and made it explicit. Peppler says, quote, the Christian imagination then, when trained by the liturgy, makes it possible for man at every odd moment of the day to be sinking back into an habitual worship flowing out from his God-focused interior bodily faculty. This account of the imagination, I note, accords very well with what Tolkien tells us about the genesis of his own mythology, whether his claim that the Lord of the Rings is fundamentally religious and Catholic, or his assertion that, quote, all his perception of beauty, both in majesty and simplicity, was founded on the Blessed Virgin Mary, or his concession that far greater things may color the mind in dealing with the lesser things of a fairy story. But to my mind, the best and clearest Tolkienian exploration of his creative process is found in his claim that the Lord of the Rings grew, quote, like a seed in the dark out of the leaf mold of the mind, out of all that has been seen or thought or read, that has long ago been forgotten, descending into the deeps. Experiences long forgotten, broken down, digested, descending to the depths of personality. It's easy to make the case that in Tolkien's life, nothing went deeper than his attachment to and participation in the liturgy. And now I'd like to very briefly consider Tolkien's biography and personal writings to gain some sense of how the liturgical imagination was formed in Tolkien and what it meant in his daily life. If you know his biography, the story is relatively simple. Liturgy came to dominate his life after his mother's conversion to Catholicism in 1900, and almost incredibly, it became more dominant in his life after her death in 1904. Tolkien and his brother Hilary were placed under the guardianship of Father Francis Morgan of the Birmingham Oratory. Under his supervision, they became, as Tolkien later reflected, virtually junior inmates of the Oratory house. In this capacity, they were expected to not only attend, but to serve Mass every morning before school, before breakfast. And very largely, they did. This upbringing set the pattern for Tolkien's later life, though there are a few times in his history where he notes that he almost ceased to practice his religion, first as an undergraduate at Oxford, and later as an early career academic at Leeds. Tolkien was, for the most part, strikingly consistent in his religious practice. This is daily Mass, regular confession. As his children grew, he recreated his own childhood experience in their lives. Up before dawn, bicycle to Mass, go home, breakfast. And this continued throughout their formative years and towards the very end of his life. The importance of the liturgy in Tolkien's life is borne out by careful attention to his personal and professional writings. When you turn to Tolkien's letters, you find discussion of abstract theological points seldom. References to anything like a broader Catholic intellectual tradition almost never. What you do find persistently, emphatically, consistently is a focus on liturgical matters. The letters are peppered with frequent references to masses attended, homilies heard, Tolkien's anxieties and frustrations regarding liturgical reforms, his observation of liturgical seasons, feasts, and fasts. Indeed, liturgical texts are so embedded in the letters and in his writings that they almost seem to force their way in where they have no natural place. So he'll write to a friend and casually quote an obscure Latin hymn that nobody knows. Or he will adapt the propers of a Mass when he's writing to someone who has no prayer of possibly understanding where it comes from. He does this without any explanation or embarrassment. As he's drafting things, we have his papers. We find liturgical text wedged into his discussions of completely unrelated points. In the papers of On Fairy Stories, he's discussing the nature of fairy and spontaneously inserts the entire text of the Te Deum. This is not, I suspect, what most of us do. But when we look more closely at Tolkien, we find that it's not as unusual as it might seem for him. According to his letters, Tolkien understood his entire life through a liturgical lens. So when his son Christopher was stationed in South Africa in World War II, Tolkien wrote and encouraged him to make frequent use of what he called the praises. These include the Gloria in Excelsis, the Magnificat, the Litany of Loretto, and a handful of psalms. Christopher should memorize these in Latin because, quote, if you have these by heart, you will never need for words of joy. Tolkien also encouraged Christopher to memorize the entire Roman canon for private recitation in case hard circumstances ever kept him from Mass. The significance of this fatherly counsel is not to be missed. Tolkien here invites his son not merely to know the liturgy, but to internalize the liturgy, to interpret his own life experience and to order it in light of the church at prayer. It's clear that he's speaking from experience. He was no mere passive participant in the liturgies. Quite the contrary, he made its words and devotions his own. And this never changed. Towards the very end of his life, Camilla Unwin, the granddaughter of his old publisher, Sir Stanley Unwin, wrote the now famous novelist to ask him what was the purpose of life. It was a school assignment. The entirety of Tolkien's response is well worth reading, but the end of it deserves certain attention. I apologize for the length of the quote. It is, I think, worth it. So it may be said that the chief purpose of our life, for any one of us, is to increase according to our capacity our knowledge of God by all the means we have, and to be moved by it to praise and thanks. To do, as we say in the Gloria in Excelsis, Laudamus te, benedicimus te, adoramus te, glorificamus te, gratias agimus tibi propter magna gloriam tuam. We praise you, we call you holy, we worship you, we proclaim your glory, we thank you for the greatness of your splendor. And in moments of exaltation, we may call on all created things to join in our chorus, speaking on their behalf, as is done in Psalm 148, or the Song of the Three Children in Daniel. Praise the Lord, all mountains and hills, all orchards and forests, all things that creep, and birds on the wing. For Tolkien, the entire purpose of life is liturgical, to love, glorify, give thanks to God, to lead all creation in a hymn of praise to the Creator. And it is what is more expressed in explicitly liturgical terms of the Gloria and the Benedicite. And what's true of all human activity is true in a special way for Tolkien in his own avocation, the telling of fairy stories. As I'm sure many of you know, Tolkien considered eucatastrophe, the sudden joyous turn at the end of the fairy story, to be, quote, the true form of fairy tale and its highest function. But it's often overlooked that eucatastrophe itself is liturgically marked for Tolkien. In the epilogue to On Fairy Stories, he states that the Christian joy, the Gloria, is of the same kind, but it is preeminently high and joyous. What makes a fairy tale is its participation in a joy of which the Gloria is the perfect expression. So in Tolkien's own reckoning, the liturgy is the great interpretive key. It's the governing pattern for his work, his life, and all human life. So now we've seen what a liturgical imagination is and how it's expressed in Tolkien's nonfiction writings. It remains to be considered how all this might impact the mythopoetic works for which Tolkien is famous. If Murray and Pepler are correct in their understanding of liturgical imagination, and if I'm right in my claim that Tolkien possessed one, we should expect to find liturgical form replicated throughout Tolkien's works, absorbed, as he said, into the story and the symbolism. I believe this is the case. I believe it's pervasive throughout the mythology. However, we've got time, 6 minutes, to consider one reflex only of Tolkien's liturgical imagination, so I propose we take the most obvious. This is the reawakening of Sam on the fields of Cormallen after the destruction of the ring and the connection of this scene to the Easter liturgy. A brief refresher. We're prepared for Sam's awakening at Cormallen by a long Lenten patterned journey. They wander through the desert, increasingly relying on the quasi-sacramental lembus. They make the ascent of the dreadful mountain. We have the final crisis when darkness is over the face of the earth. We have an earthquake. And above all, we've got the gradual canonic emptying of Frodo and Sam. They are naked in the dark. They're stripped of everything. They die, or very nearly die, in their quest. The last words of Frodo to Sam read almost as a distant echo of the consummatum est. It is finished. The quest is achieved. Now all is over. I'm glad you are here with me here at the end of all things. But of course, the heroes are not dead. They're born out of the fire. They eventually rise again. Having fully assented to their own destruction, they are, in Louis Bouillet's terms, primed for, quote, the ravishing rediscovery of the universe upon emerging from the dark night. But it's not just the idea of resurrection that connects the scene to Easter. The entire imagery of the chapter leaves the reader with the unmistakable impression of Easter morning. As Sam puts it, I feel like spring after winter, sun on leaves, trumpets and harps, and all the songs I've ever heard. In the passage immediately following, we get clear sunshine and the sound of water, the reintroduction of music, laughter and weeping, and the renewal of the whole face of the earth. In this context, it's difficult to encounter Gandalf, quote, robed in white, his beard now gleaming like pure snow, without thinking of the angelic witnesses to the resurrection in the Gospels, whose robes are, variously, depending on evangelist, white, shining, and like snow. Or to hear Sam exclaiming his wonder at not one, but two apparent resurrections. I thought you were dead, but then I thought I was dead myself. Is everything sad going to come untrue? Without being returned to the Paschal feast. Then we reflect that all this occurs not across the entire chapter, but in the first few paragraphs after Sam awakens in Ithilien, and we may begin to suspect that Tolkien's use of Paschal imagery was conscious and deliberate. This suspicion should not be suppressed. As the story rolls on, the Paschal imagery and emotions give way to overt hints, and the comparison with Easter becomes very nearly explicit. Gandalf tells Sam that the ring was destroyed on March 25th, the date of the Annunciation, the date of the crucifixion, and that the new year in Gondor will always begin on that day, as it did in medieval England. When Arwen arrives at Minas Tirith to marry Aragorn, Frodo very nearly echoes the words of the Exultet, where the Easter proclamation hails the truly blessed night when things of heaven are wed to things of earth, the night which shall be as light as day and become as light itself in delight. Frodo exclaims, now not day only shall be beloved, but night too shall be beautiful and blessed, and all its fear pass away. But the most important note is sounded at the celebration in the fields of Cormallen. When the minstrel sings the deeds of Frodo and Sam, his melodies have a striking effect on the audience. Quote, their hearts, wounded with sweet words, overflowed. Their joy was like swords, and they passed in thought out to regions where pain and delight flow together, and tears are the very wine of blessedness. This passage has been the subject of critical scrutiny. Tom Shippey found the combination of delight, tears, and laughter unconvincing. But for anyone who's felt the full force of the transition from the dark night of Good Friday to Easter morning, I think the emotion is more understandable. But this passage goes deeper than the others. While other passages in the chapter are patterned on the resurrection, this one is, in Tolkien's own writings, directly and immediately connected with it. Indeed, of all the eucatastrophic moments in The Lord of the Rings, the reaction to the minstrel's song most clearly recalls Tolkien's explicit description of eucatastrophe in a letter to Christopher. The resurrection, he says, was the greatest eucatastrophe possible and the greatest fairy story. It produces that essential emotion, Christian joy, which produces tears, because it is qualitatively so like sorrow, because it comes from those places where joy and sorrow are at one reconciled. The similarity of the passages makes no doubt possible. The heroes of The Lord of the Rings are participators in what Tolkien calls the fundamental Christian joy, the joy of which the resurrection is the perfect example. Father Michael Ward has pointed out that the celebration on the fields of Cormallen was for Tolkien the climax of his entire work. And as well it might be. At this point, the boundary between Tolkien's fantasy and Tolkien's faith becomes vanishingly thin, and his great fairy tale touches the hem of something greater still. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. If we had time, we could talk about the days of rejoicing that followed the destruction of the ring and their relationship to Eastertide. Or we could examine the coronation of Aragorn in light of Ascension Day liturgies. Or we could consider Tolkien's strange Christmas at Rivendell. Or we might go beyond the Lord of the Rings itself and go into the larger mythology. Consider the liturgical overtones of Tolkien's creation myth, or the clear dependence of the fall of Numenor on Old Testament liturgical celebrations, but these are perhaps matters for another day. I hope that the preceding conversation has been enough to show what I mean by liturgical imagination and to demonstrate, at least briefly, how such a concept might aid our understanding of Tolkien's creative achievement. In the slender time I have left, I would like to offer a few reflections about the importance of the concept of liturgical imagination for broader understandings of Catholic imagination and culture. The action of The Hobbit begins, as everyone knows, with Gandalf's famous inquiry into the precise meaning of the words, "Good morning." Do you wish me a good morning, or mean that it is a morning to be a good morning whether I want it or not, or that you feel good this morning, or that it is a morning to be good on? With a few modifications, we could apply the same treatment to the term Catholic imagination. Is this an imagination possessed by an individual Catholic, or an exercise of imagination in a specifically Catholic manner, or perhaps it's Catholicism as imagined in art? Any one of these definitions can be defended. Any one of these definitions is lively. A brief survey of our conference program suggests that all of them and more are alive and well. This is good because the subject is of vital importance. As Oldham suggested over 80 years ago, quote, if Christian people are to join in the work of planning and reconstructing civilization and hope by doing so to bring us nearer to a secular order in which Christian life can be better lived, they must unleash the power of Christian imagination. It was Oldham's generalized praise of the Christian imagination that prompted Murray and Pepler after him to develop their more restricted and more robust notion of the specifically liturgical imagination. And this concept, I would suggest, is no less important today. After all, only by recapturing this sense of Catholic imagination can we ever hope to really understand the works of the great culture-building figures in the history of Christendom, a St. Augustine, a Dante, or yes, even a John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. Just as importantly, only by cultivating this liturgical imagination ourselves can we hope to carry on a comparable work in our own day. Thank you very much.
Okay, all right, next we have Professor John Balsbaugh of Hillsdale College, who will present on the way of beauty is the way of truth, imagination, desire, and openness to transcendence.
Thank you. So I come to this topic as an academic, yes, but even more importantly, as an educator. And without being alarmist, I think it is fair to say that education in our time has a truth problem. So this is a diagnosis and a proposal. In the 30 years I've been teaching, students have become less certain that truth can be found or even sought. They're increasingly skeptical of tradition, hesitant to make truth claims or moral judgments, and cautious in discussing ultimate ideas. On questions of philosophy, religion, or the human person, they are quick to agree to disagree. And having no capacity to adjudicate between their positions, they're more likely to talk about what is true for you and what is true for me. Now, I'm putting the matter a bit starkly, and there are always exceptions, probably many in this room, but I'm confident this has been the overall trend. Of course, a little epistemic humility never hurt anyone, but when it serves only as a mask for a loss of confidence in the truth, then we have a genuine crisis in education. Several sociological accounts have been offered to explain these changes. Robert Bellah identified the rise of expressive individualism as early as 1985, and in their 2005 study of the religious lives of teenagers, Christian Smith and Melina Lundquist-Denton argued that a new default religion had become the norm, an all-encompassing view of the world they called moral therapeutic deism. 2 years later, Charles Taylor published A Secular Age, describing the gradual transformation of our world from one in which openness to transcendence was taken for granted to one in which our default settings incline us to behave like buffered selves living within a closed, immanent frame. Now, from a religious educator's perspective, one of the most interesting concepts to emerge from these works is Taylor's account of cross-pressured belief. The whole culture, he writes, expresses cross-pressures between the draw of narratives of closed immanence on one side and the sense of their inadequacy on the other. In other words, Even as religious persons, the explanatory value of materialistic science is so powerful as to be difficult to ignore. What if my experience of love is really only sexual difference plus pheromones? What if stellar death is actually the end of the story? What if my very self, my soul, this being indoors each one dwells, is nothing more than neurons firing, an epiphenomenon of electricity and gray matter? On the other hand, it isn't easy to fully embrace materialism in our time either. That powerful sense of self or profound experience of love is as haunting to the would-be materialist as stellar death is to the would-be person of faith. Hence, we are cross-pressured. Some of these accounts are indeed helpful in explaining the situation of truth in the current educational climate. But in the glory of the Lord, Hans Urs von Balthasar issued a prophetic warning that may provide an even deeper and more integral theological account. He writes, "No longer loved or fostered by religion, beauty is lifted from its face as a mask, and its absence exposes features on that face which threaten to become incomprehensible to man. We no longer dare to believe in beauty, and we make of it a mere appearance in order the more easily to dispose of it. Our situation today shows that beauty demands for itself at least as much courage and decision as do truth and goodness, and she will not allow herself to be separated and banned from her two sisters without taking them along with herself in an act of mysterious vengeance." What Balthasar saw, even in the 1960s, was the disintegration then of the Transcendentals, a process that began not with some secular agenda, but with the religious neglect of beauty. So perhaps our curious, cross-pressured, anxious, skeptical half-belief is nothing more or less than our response to the incomprehensibility of truth when divorced from beauty. Perhaps the disintegration we are witnessing in our public life and thought mirrors the disintegration of the Transcendentals themselves. If this, or something like this, is true, the important question for educators becomes, what can we do to create a pedagogy of reintegration within a wider culture of disintegration? If being an integrated person in a disintegrated world would be a mark of holiness, how can we help our students become such people? To propose a project like this is audacious at best, so please take what follows only as a suggestion for how we might make our way through the brambles and glimpse the beginning of a path. It is tempting to think that the first task in such a project would be to shore up and defend propositional truth. If only students were well-grounded in theology, philosophy, church teaching, and morality, we wouldn't have the problems we have, right? But if Balthasar is correct, this would be a mistake, both theologically and practically. For one thing, as the first to be dismissed, beauty must be the first to be invited back. To find the path, we have to return to the point at which we strayed from it. Practically, the major challenge of beginning with truth is that our students already swim in an ocean of competing truths, competing narratives, competing interests, and even competing facts. The ground upon which matters of truth are negotiated has become so contested as to be terrifying. For many of our students, to step into the arena of ethical or philosophical truth claims is to step into a battlefield laced with mines and teeming with unseen enemies. There's little to be gained, much to be lost, and no readily apparent strategy for engagement. The propositional truths of the church are only one more competing narrative. The same is not true of beauty, at least not our experience of it. For instance, even as rough and ready Americans, we're on far more common ground, at the same time among a far more diverse crowd, when we are gathered specifically to share an experience of beauty. Whether that is a sunset over the Grand Canyon, a Wallace Stevens poetry reading, or a Willie Nelson concert. In those contexts, our competing viewpoints matter far less. As Balthasar put it, Beauty is the disinterested one. So let us begin with beauty. Perhaps ironically, in dealing with beauty as a transcendental, the first thing we must do is address the nature of first-person subjective experience itself. As David Foster Wallace put it so well, there is no experience you have had that you are not the absolute center of. The world as you experience it is there in front of you or behind you, to the left or right of you, on your TV or your monitor. This much is inescapable. But there are different ways I can deal with my first-person subjective experiences. I can treat them as experiences for, or I can treat them as experiences of. In the first mode, I treat my experience, including my experience of other people, as empirical data for my own project. I collect experiences for myself because they help me understand my world. They're what I use to construct my meaning. Every experience is ultimately about me, my needs, my perspective, my framework. Experiences are meaningless apart from the pattern that I impose upon them. Experiences of are oriented very differently. A genuine experience of a living thing, a moment in the liturgy, the woman in line with me at Starbucks, or even a mathematical formula, requires that I set aside my project of constructing meaning and open myself to receive meaning coming from outside of me. The Italian priest, theologian, and educator Luigi Giussani describes such experiences, especially those with other persons, as encounters, noting that an encounter is characterized as the impact with something exceptional, capable of metamorphosing life, changing its shape, its outline, so as to create a new world. According to Giussani, encounters like this are matters of bumping into a sign, an objective reality that moves the person toward his telos, toward his destiny. What might these encounters look like? Think of Parker's vision of the tattooed man in Flannery O'Connor's Parker's Back. Parker had never before felt the least motion of wonder in himself. Until he saw the man at the fair, it did not enter his head that there was anything out of the ordinary about the fact that he existed. Even then it did not enter his head, but a peculiar unease settled in him. It was as if a blind boy had been turned so gently in a different direction that he did not know his destination had been changed. Augustine's conversion experience of hearing a voice, as of a boy or girl I know not, chanting and oft repeating, take up and read, also belongs in this category. So does Alyosha Karamazov's lifelong image of his mother snatching him up in both arms, squeezing him close till it hurt, and praying for him to the Mother of God. C.S. Lewis's childhood encounter with Squirrel Nutkin fits. And the disciples on the way to Emmaus had this kind of experience of the risen Christ, leading them to reflect later, did our hearts not burn within us while he talked with us on the road? These are all paradigmatic experiences of the beautiful. And Balthasar writes with great clarity about the effect such encounters have upon us. Before the beautiful, no, not really before, but within the beautiful, the whole person quivers. He not only finds the beautiful moving, rather he experiences himself as being moved and possessed by it. Such a person has been taken up wholesale into the reality of the beautiful and is now fully subordinate to it, determined by it, animated by it. Now, in terms of education, it's worth pausing a moment just to imagine what a student who has become subordinated to, determined, and animated by beauty would look like. And having done so, it's worth asking, how can we ensure that our educational practices give such students an opportunity to be formed in this way? Because if we cannot facilitate these kinds of encounters, there's no reason to go any further. Merely gathering experiences and constructing meaning for oneself will produce in the end nothing but isolation, anxiety, and to quote Wallace again, the freedom all to be lords of our tiny skull-sized kingdoms, alone at the center of creation. On the other hand, if we could develop a pedagogy that fosters openness to being, we may then be able to help our students actually escape the gravitational pull of pervasive isolation that seems to be a unique marker of our time. And this leads to the second element we need for a pedagogy of reintegration, a true community of wonder set up in opposition to the isolating forces of the age. In the 19th century, Dostoevsky saw this crisis coming and anticipated that isolation would only increase. He was right. But in the voice of Father Zosima's mysterious visitor, he also expressed confidence that this terrible individualism must inevitably have an end. Until then, we must keep the banner flying and so draw men's souls out of their solitude. In The Four Loves, C.S. Lewis suggests that intellectual community, the kind you might find in a school like the one we are imagining, could play a role here. Friendship, he writes, arises out of mere companionship when two or more of the companions discover that they have in common some insight or interest or even taste which the others do not share, and which, till that moment, each believed to be his own unique treasure or burden. The typical expression of opening friendship would be something like, "What? You too? I thought I was the only one." Now, having already imagined the kinds of students that are formed by encounters with beauty, imagine a school or an educational institution in which teachers and students who have made it their primary aim to remain open to beauty were to share that openness with each other. Their shared treasure might not be any peculiar taste or narrow interest, but this extraordinary openness to being moved by anything, whether it be a Cézanne landscape, an English novel, a poem, or just the evening light in the garden. If an educational space like that could be created, it would be a significant accomplishment, indeed. And it would be the work of beauty, returned at last to her proper place in the order of ultimate things. But the aim here was not just to restore beauty to her place, but to reintegrate beauty with truth and goodness. Setting goodness aside for a moment, then, we come back to the question of truth. We cannot, of course, afford to leave truth out of the equation any more than we can dispense with beauty. But after so long and troubling a separation, neither should we expect, once beauty has been restored, that all the propositional truths of the Summa and every moral teaching of the Church will immediately rush back in unscathed and restored to the place they once held in the Catholic social imaginary. If we're looking for authentic reintegration, then in matters of truth, we will probably have to move forward with humility and patience. In Education at the Crossroads, Jacques Maritain offers this promising approach to truth. Truth, which does not depend on us, but on what is. Truth is not a set of ready-made formulas to be passively recorded so as to have the mind closed and enclosed by them. Truth is an infinite realm, as infinite as being, whose wholeness transcends infinitely our powers of perception, and each fragment of which must be grasped through vital and purified internal activity. Maritain's definition here is both ennobling and humbling. This kind of truth could be sought both vigorously and patiently. It is truly infinite, not merely exhaustive, so we can afford to be patient. And we can work humbly to address the current crisis in truth because it does not depend on us. So what if for a time we were to ask from truth what Robert Frost suggested poetry aims at? A clarification of life, not necessarily a great clarification, but a momentary stay against confusion. Perhaps the philosopher and the theologian could become friends with Walker Percy's would-be novelist at the end of the world and pick up from his method. Instead of constructing a plot and creating a cast of characters from a world familiar to everybody, Percy writes, he is more apt to set forth with a stranger in a strange land where the signposts are enigmatic, but which he sets out to explore nevertheless. This provisionally more open and imaginative stance towards truth does not diminish its importance. or eliminate any authentic consideration of philosophical and theological propositions. Rather, it broadens the scope of mystery and expands the respect due to it, forcing us to keep our pursuit of truth from outpacing our experience of beauty and leaving her behind once again. As Ann Carpenter has pointed out, Balthasar's radical hope in the face of his devastating critiques of both theology and art is that the profound place of vulnerability each has found itself occupying will, in grace, turn out to be a strength and an opportunity. I've placed this conversation in the context of education and suggested that a formal pedagogy might be developed along these lines. What would it look like? I'm not as sure, but I will end by suggesting a few outlines. First of all, desire would matter. As Balthasar said, to want to see the stained glass window from the inside is already to believe. There would have to be space provided in such an education for encounter, not merely instruction. Arguments would be rigorous, but moral instincts and flashes of insight would also be welcome. The arts would have to play a major role in its curriculum, but encounters with beauty would be expected as much as math and science as in art and literature. Reality and being are ultimately one. Therefore, while specialization would have its place, the school or institution we're talking about would be more inclined towards interdisciplinary thinking. Imagination would be at least as important as analysis in every field of inquiry. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the educators in this school or institution would be the sort of people who are moved by beauty themselves, unashamed to model, discuss it, and willing to ask important questions in the pursuit of truth, not merely give important answers. Of course, this all may only amount to a great what if. But in a world that very much needs imaginative solutions to its epistemic and educational challenges, what if may be the most powerful question of all. Thank you.
Okay, so our third and final speaker is Professor Siobhan Maloney Latar from Trinity School at Meadow. She will be presenting on Image of the Maker, George MacDonald, J.R.R. Tolkien, and the Sacramental Imagination.
In a lecture commemorating Dante, the French poet Paul Claudel makes the provocative claim that the modern crisis of thought, which views the world as merely a dead, material datum, is not first an intellectual crisis, but the crisis of a starved imagination. It is because, he says, we have separated thought from the imagination and sense perception that we have fallen into errors. Quote, on one hand, our superficial knowledge of the world has prodigiously increased due to the new materials that science has put at the disposal of each of us. On the other hand, God belongs to an unknown world, which is also, they say, unknowable. And so it is too easy for minds elsewhere occupied and accustomed only to tactile matters to confuse this unknown world with nothing, unquote. How, he strikingly insists later, can we desire in the depths of our heart and our soul something that we cannot form a sensible image of? As a result, Claudel insists that cultivating the imagination is essential to the defense of religiosity in the modern age. For Claudel, this is the first task of poets and artists, to give new forms to the imagination, to speak in images as Christ did in his parables, and present truth and beauty in new ways, to give flesh to spiritual realities once more in our artistic creations, so that we can access the spiritual anew through the material. Why do I start with Claudel in this talk on MacDonald and Tolkien? Because I think that both MacDonald and Tolkien took up in their lives, the work that they took up in their lives as a direct answer to Claudel's call. MacDonald specifically is the lesser known of these two, and also himself not formally Catholic. And yet I find his understanding of the imagination, its foundation, and its work in Christian life to be steeped in deeply Catholic principles. MacDonald has yet to receive the credit he deserves for saving the concept of the imagination in an empiricist industrial age that had dismissed it into the realms of dreams and childish fancies, that untrustworthy aspect of man's nature. MacDonald's work gives an answer to the new scientific mindset that before the World Wars was still in its young hubris seeking to eradicate all mystery from the world and establish reason and scientific certainty as the watchmen of the age. In this environment, MacDonald recognized the danger of a world that assumes that all things can be measured, dissected, explained, and that automatically evacuates all areas of life that do not easily succumb to this. Similarly to Claudel, half a century later, he saw that what was lost with the imagination was the whole spiritual realm itself, and ultimately the divine. I wish to share with you then MacDonald's understanding of the imagination in this context and some examples of Tolkien's work that I find reflect these principles. One could summarize MacDonald's understanding of the imagination in the twofold aspects of gift and task. For MacDonald, the imagination is the tool God has given the person with which to discern the sign character of the world and to be able to express in communicable form what he has found. I will take a moment to examine both of these and what they propose for a Catholic understanding of imagination. So first, the gift dimension reflects the fact primarily that MacDonald ceaselessly speaks of the imagination as a dependent reality, dependent both on God's creative initiative as source and origin of all things, such that our imaginative capacity does not originate from us, and dependent on the given reality of the created world, which serves as the material on which our imagination works and creates in the first place. Rather than the common assumption that the imagination is the place where man has the most freedom to set himself up in opposition to or independence from any given reality, MacDonald insists on the origin and foundation of the imagination being given by God and dependent on the world he has created. MacDonald begins his essay on the imagination with the claim, quote, "To inquire into what God has made is the main function of the imagination. It is aroused by facts, is nourished by facts, seeks for higher and yet higher laws in those facts," unquote. The imagination is first then an obediential faculty. It is the tool given to man by which to discern the hidden things of God in the material creation. For MacDonald, it is God's own method of creation as an unveiling of himself to us that grounds the task of our imaginations in looking for and identifying what he has designed for us to discover. MacDonald says, quote, "No thought, human or divine, can be conveyed from man to man save through the symbolism of creation. The heaven and the earth are around us that it may be possible for us to speak of the unseen by the seen. For the outermost husk of creation has correspondence with the deepest things of the Creator. He is not a God that hideth himself, but a God who made that he might reveal," unquote. Creation itself is replete with images, with physical manifestations of deep spiritual truths. The logic of the imagination's task of creativity is grounded then, first and foremost, in the logic of the sign character of creation. If one understands by sacramental the visible or material manifestation of an invisible spiritual reality, then MacDonald certainly understands the whole material order, first and foremost, in sacramental and image-rich terms, along with many of the fathers of the Church. Creation for them is a fundamentally figurative reality, a sign that reveals something more than itself, namely God. For MacDonald, God designs the world in this way out of a desire to involve us in the discovery and unfolding of creation. The hiddenness or distance within creation, this veiled dimension to the material world, as MacDonald will call it, is God's way of drawing us into the search for him. MacDonald describes this when he reflects, quote, "I think God sometimes has great trouble in separating us far enough from himself that he can look round and know us. A mother will take her child and set it just as far as their arms can reach and draw back a little, so that the child may turn and run back to her. This is the first and most important lesson. That is what God has been doing all the time through all the ages," unquote. This leads us to the task dimension of the imagination. For MacDonald, the imagination at the same time as being given and dependent is no less carries with it a calling, a response from us that takes the form of our own creative activity within the world. Imagination's primary task for MacDonald is to discover and communicate the truth of the world, to penetrate beyond these images to awaken and discover the latent meaning the Creator has placed in them. The imagination has the duty, MacDonald says, of, quote, following and finding out the divine imagination in whose image it was made, unquote. In this sense, both the gift and the task dimensions of the imagination follow from the very structure of creation itself. Our use of our imagination is a part of our participation in the Creator's original making, a participation in the unveiling of things themselves, and thus, in some sense, a participation in bringing them to their full reality through an apprehension and understanding of them. If the logic of creation points to the capacity of the physical to display the invisible and the metaphoric to display the real, the primordial example of this is the fact of the incarnation, of the invisible God revealing himself in physical form. Christ, for MacDonald, is the ultimate revelation and unveils the Father precisely within the veil of human flesh. Quote, the only refuge from man's blinding and paralyzing theories is the Son of Man. For no misrepresentations and no misconception can destroy the beauty of that face, which the marring of sorrow has elevated into the region of reality. From the God of man's painting, we turn to the man of God's being, and he leads us to the true God, the radiation of whose glory we first see in him, unquote. God's very coming in the flesh is not an exception to, but rather the full flowering of his work in creation. It is his paradoxical drawing back from us, precisely in drawing near, his coming close to us in such a way as to give us the space to see him. The most notable reflection of this occurs in MacDonald's sermon, where he says, quote, think what an abyss of truth was our Lord, out of whose divine darkness, through that revealing countenance, that uplifting voice, was not his very human form a veil hung over the face of the truth, that even in part by dimming the effulgence of the glory it might reveal? What could be conveyed must thus be conveyed, and infinite more must lie behind, unquote. Here it is remarkably the veiled aspect of Christ's human form that allows for the effulgence of his glory to be revealed. It is his material body that discloses the spiritual God. MacDonald therefore refers to the incarnation as the quintessential fulfillment of this veiled unveiling dynamic that makes up the very structure of material creation. This revelation of the divine precisely in what is other than the divine, and which in turn lays the groundwork and mandate for our imaginative activity. Because the structure of the world and of God's way of revealing himself to us takes this hidden form, there is therefore just as much a discovering dimension to the imagination's work as there is a creative one. If you were at the keynote last night, Judith Wolfe used both those terms, finding and making, to refer to the imagination. MacDonald similarly refers not just to the Greek word poiesis for the artist as maker, but also the French term trouver, finder, as equally relevant to what the work of the imagination is doing. Because of this task, MacDonald insists that of all the imagination's artistic expressions, the genre of the poetic can be the most luminous, precisely because it is in the business of figurative language, of making use of things found in the world and in human life as figures to uncover invisible or abstract realities to the recipient. For this reason, MacDonald gave the name poetic to any creative literary work that relies on the use of figures and metaphors, and asserts that such genres of story, myth, and fantasy are essential methods for communicating truth. Quote, the form of the parable is the first in which truth will admit of being embodied. Nor is this all, it is likewise the fullest, and to the parable will the teacher of the truth ever return, unquote. By using parables, MacDonald tells us, Christ conveyed more of the truth than could have been conveyed by any other form. It is important to note here that for MacDonald, to make use of physical images and symbols to communicate invisible truths is not then to say less about the thing or to give a partial view. Paradoxically, the use of images rather serves to reveal more clearly and more perfectly what is otherwise invisible. As MacDonald insists, quote, let no one say I have been speaking in a figure merely. That I have been so speaking, I know. But many things which we see most vividly and certainly are more truly expressed by using a right figure than by attempting to give them a clear outline of logical expression, unquote. The intention of a painting, for example, is to portray most truly and splendidly the scene or reality it is an imitation of. The poetic, in contrast for MacDonald, whether a poem, a story, or a fairy tale, is making use of a variety of realities in relation to each other, to bring the reader to something more, something else entirely, to give them a specific experience that cannot be summed up in discursive description. Therefore, the paradox of poetic creativity, MacDonald says, is that, quote, in a work of poetry, the making is justified by the fact that while the image is less than the reality, it is also more, unquote. This indirect or distant nature of the poetic method for MacDonald thus imitates God's method with us in creation and incarnation, in demanding more of the recipient, leaving more space for their freedom to respond to and seek out what the poetic communicates. By God's forming of the world according to this logic of sign and image in order to reveal, we see that this method leaves us the space to respond. His glory does not overwhelm us. It reveres our freedom and invites a response. Thus, the distant aspect of the poetic, its making space for the response of the reader, imitates most fully God's respectful distance that enables the person's free return of love. MacDonald describes this dynamic when he says, quote, the best thing you can do for your fellow, next to rousing his conscience, is not to give him things to think about, but to wake things up that are in him, or say to make him think things for himself. The best nature does for us is to work in us such moods in which thoughts of high import arise. Does any aspect of nature wake but one thought? Does she ever suggest only one definite thing? Does she not set feeling and so thinking at work? Unquote. In some sense, it is Tolkien the Catholic who takes MacDonald's observations on the incarnation and its effect on man's creativity to, I think, a deeper dimension. It is Tolkien who recognizes that the fact that God has taken on flesh not only reveals the capacity of flesh to disclose the divine, but in turn redeems and hallows flesh itself, restores to the material its full dignity in its own right. Tolkien portrays the glories of creation not simply for what they reveal about God, but for the wonder they themselves are, which seems to be the full flowering of MacDonald's conception of the work of the imagination. I want to briefly give some examples of this here in Tolkien's work. For Tolkien, this veiled, unveiling dimension of reality described by MacDonald is the same foundation for the value of fantasy. So Tolkien speaks more of fantasy than he does the poetic in the general terms of MacDonald. For Tolkien, it is what this veiled, unveiling dimension is what enables fantasy to recover the truth of the world for the reader, precisely by enabling an escape from a reduced vision of things and into a comprehensive one. This is why Tolkien identified three main effects that authentic fantasy exhibits: recovery, escape, and consolation. In some sense, all three of these aspects encapsulate both the gift and task dimension of MacDonald's vision. By saying that authentic fantasy recovers for the reader a truer vision of the world is to acknowledge that there is a given reality that precedes the writer, which even the creator of fantasy is answerable to. Tolkien insists, quote, we need recovery. We should look at green again and be startled anew, but not blinded by blue and yellow and red. We should meet the centaur and the dragon, and then perhaps suddenly behold, like the ancient shepherds, sheep and dogs and horses and wolves. This recovery fairy stories help us to make, unquote. Similarly, what Tolkien means by escape is to acknowledge that this reduced and confining view of reality that we encapsulate ourselves with is precisely that, and must be broken open in order for us to recover a fuller, truer sense of the God-given wholeness of reality. This escape and recovery in turn paves the way for an authentic consolation, the consolation Tolkien tells us of the happy ending, or the eucatastrophe. The acknowledgement in story form of the deepest truth of reality, that it is indeed good, and that the final word on darkness and difficulty of our human history is redemption, resurrection, and eternal joy beyond the bounds of the world. For this dimension of fantasy, Tolkien says, quote, and I think this is maybe a similar quote to what Professor Reinhard used here, the sudden happy turn in a story which pierces you with a joy that brings tears. It produces its peculiar effect because it is a sudden glimpse of truth. Your whole nature chained in a material cause and effect, the chain of death, feels a sudden relief, as if a major limb out of joint had suddenly snapped back. This is indeed how things really do work in the great world for which our nature is made, unquote. All three of these aspects for Tolkien are best enacted in fantasy because it is precisely in fantasy that we are in a sense removed from our familiar, reduced vision of the world we have grown accustomed to and are enabled to see it with new eyes, as it were, precisely through the mediation of images, symbols, and metaphors. In short, what MacDonald claims for poetry in general, Tolkien claims specifically for fantasy, this capacity to reveal the truth more luminously under the veil of new images and symbols. The characters of the Ents in Tolkien's work are, I think, a particularly apt example of this, so I want to just end with giving that kind of concrete example here. Tall, sturdy, strong, slow, and old, they have the characteristics of a tree deeply rooted, who has been taking in the slow unfolding of his surroundings over long years of time. On the other hand, they have a conscious, intelligent degree of life. They move and speak and think as a man, having a human-like face and limbs. And yet it would be an injustice to a figure such as Treebeard to indicate that he is simply tree plus man, for he has an infinitely complex fusion of the two, in such a way as to truly make him a new thing. There is something inherently tree-ish about the manner in which Ents live the otherwise human aspect of language, for example, in its slow, reflective, gradual unfolding. Similarly, we discover that Ents stand up to sleep and lay down to think, making their default position standing, much more like a tree than a man, who has to work at and learn how to stand. The Ents then recover for us a deeper understanding of the original things themselves, tree and man, by allowing us to escape from our usual vision of both through this veil of this third thing, entirely new. In encountering an Ent, we see in sharper relief what belongs to treeness itself, and at the same time as what belongs to humanness itself, precisely because an Ent is not, in the end, either one. This seems to me to be precisely what MacDonald has in mind for the true capacity of the poetic to reveal the invisible aspects of reality. In conclusion, then, if creation is itself fundamentally revelatory of the spiritual more precisely by means of its physicality, and if the flesh of Christ discloses the invisible God precisely by means of its human limitations, then the poetic is the privileged place for man's creative task of disclosing the invisible truths of the world. For MacDonald, it is this that gives the poetic its capacity to affect all aspects of man's life and to hold an essential, not optional place in man's divine vocation within the world. It is therefore the logic of creation itself and of the incarnation that together form the foundation for MacDonald's claiming this veiled, unveiling dynamic for man's poesis as well. Both Tolkien and MacDonald disclose to us an illuminating understanding of the task of the imagination. Man, as embodied spirit, is the imaging creature. He is the one who enters into relation with things through their presentation of themselves to him, and through his re-articulating of them back to himself and to others. All of our creativity requires a faithfulness to our place as image bearer, tasked with participating in God's revelation of himself within the world. MacDonald's vision of the imagination and this respectful distance of man's poesis is more crucial than ever if we are to remain faithful to our Christian vocation to participate in the effoliation of God's creation, as Tolkien would say. We live in a world in which man's relationship with reality has become one of pure domination, and creativity is often viewed as man's capacity to make, as it were, ex nihilo, with no reference to something outside of him, already carrying an inherent meaning within it. In such a context, the insight of MacDonald's thought is more necessary and more luminous than ever. It offers an alternative way to understand the gift and task of imagination. Only by acknowledging his dependence can man be truly said to create, and to fulfill MacDonald's hope that through embracing our given sonship, we shall come far nearer ourselves to creating. MacDonald says, quote, "Every new embodiment of a known truth must be a new and wider revelation. No man is capable of seeing for himself the whole of any truth. He needs it echoed back to him from every soul in the universe, and still its center is hid in the Father of lights." Unquote. Thank you.
Okay, so we have about 12 minutes for questions, and I'll try to bring the mic and keep a tab on who raise their hands first. Try to keep the question concise, please. That would be much appreciated.
Just a question for Dr. Reinhard. Appreciated the panoptic view of Tolkien's, both his letters and his works. There was a passage I was thinking of when you were outlining the liturgical imagination in Tolkien from his letters, where he's counseling his son, and he actually says to him, go to a mass that's going to frustrate you, where the preaching is bad, the music is jangling, and no one's paying attention. So I was just thinking about that passage, and I just wanted to see if you had any ideas as to how that particular letter or that particular moment fit within your understanding of his liturgical imagination.
That's an excellent question. Am I speaking correctly into this? Okay. That's an excellent question. I think it's always worth remembering context in Tolkien's letters.
Yeah.
So as he's writing to his son there, right, he's advising the most profitable spiritual exercise that you could do at Mass, which is to focus, first of all, on what's actually happening, but then also to take the time to pray for it. That's the key thing, right? As you're there with the open-collared and dirty youths and all these, and the children who yawn from the moment that the chalice is uncovered, right? Be there with them and pray for them. And so he's advising his son, and in moments of real frustration, what he could do for a particularly profitable spiritual exercise, right? In other letters, Tolkien shows himself to be very much more appreciative of liturgy better done. You know, we came into Assisi for the feast of St. Chiara. Cardinal, for crying out loud, I forget which cardinal was there, but silver trumpets at the elevation. Oh, the Italians do it. So obviously there's a push and a pull, but in that particular letter, I think he's offering highly specific spiritual advice, which does reorient towards the most important things of the liturgy. So I think that's how I'd answer.
I saw a hand, second hand over there. No. No more? Okay. So someone was raising.
I had a question probably for the second two presenters, probably principally Dr. Balsbaugh. You contrasted experience for and experience of. What about experience through? I often think a question to ask students is not only what you see in this, but what you see through it. And I go back to Tennyson's, I'm part of all that I have met, but all experience is an arch where through gleams that yet untraveled world, whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. When we go back to the truth, I always see in the encyclical Splendor of the Truth, the definition, St. Albert's definition of beauty, of splendor of the form, in which you're seeing something, you're seeing some sort of ideal of perfection, even through its imperfect realization in the thing.
Well, it's a great point, and would I do this again, I will steal your idea and add experience through. In a lot of ways, I think that's what Balthasar is getting at with that phrase from the introduction to the glory of the Lord that I used at the end. To want to see the stained glass window from the inside is already to believe. And we could go into a lot there about iconography and, image and reality. But I think that there is very much something in his thought and then in proper education where exactly how you're putting it is exactly precise. Like through the appearance of this light coming to me as one who stands outside, I am actually brought into something quite other than either myself or the thing itself. So experience through, I think, is critical to particularly religious education, but probably all good poetic, humane education. Thank you. Did you want to address that?
Thank you very much. This is a question for the first presenter. Do we see examples of Tolkien annotating the liturgy into other people's books and other people's writing that he's reading? So obviously he's writing letters and he's putting it into his letters and to his own writing, but do we see him putting in the liturgy as almost commentary on other people's writing?
I'm trying to think of an example where he does. I've not made any careful study of Tolkien's library. I think that'd probably be where you'd want to go because obviously he's a great owner and also annotator of books. From the readily available published sources, you don't see that very often. I can't think of an instance where you see that. But that would be a very, very interesting thing to follow up on if one had access to the library itself.
Thank you all for your wonderful talks. This is a question for Professor Reinhard. As you mentioned, it's important to take the context of Tolkien's letters into account. Now, I don't agree with this counter-argument, but this is one that I've heard from people. The context of Tolkien's letter 142, which is the one where he talks about Catholicism being fundamental to the Lord of the Rings, was written to Father Murray, or at that time Seminarian Murray, who many say that it was an attempt for Tolkien to subsequently ascribe Catholicism to the work in order to justify that to Father Murray. Father Murray, even later in a letter to Michael Witt, actually mentions that he doesn't quite buy it. He thinks it's more of a medieval influence. Now, I don't think that counter-argument's really justified. I'm also curious to hear your comments on it, but also if you could also reflect on, Professor Latar did mention, she mentioned creation, and it reminded me of subcreation, Tolkien's created term in on fairy stories. I was curious about how you can weave those things in and try to, I guess, defend a literal and honest interpretation of Tolkien's statement.
So granted, Tolkien's statement there is slightly more complicated than I presented it. At the same time, I think there are three things to say. Acknowledging that, in a later letter, he says one critic, meaning Father Murray, detected in the invocations of Elbereth and the character of Galadriel reminiscences of the Blessed Virgin Mary. He says, well, I guess that's sort of true, right? So obviously those contexts matter. But first of all, I would suggest that Murray's qualification might be a distinction without a difference, right? It's more of a medieval imagination than a Catholic imagination. I'm not exactly sure how one would say that's distinct, or rather than just saying that's a subset of the Catholic imagination. If you look at the broader complex of writings that exist, I think the overwhelming weight of the evidence suggests that it is, in fact, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. Whether you're looking at the claim that he makes elsewhere that the War of the Ring is not primarily about freedom, though of course that's involved, it is about God and his sole right to divine honor. Or if you look at his irritation at critics that missed the religious element in his work, he actually expresses irritation at critics who say there's no religion in his work. When he works with Donald Swann on the song cycles, he points out that these things are drawn from Gregorian chant, right? So the letters do have to be contextualized. But when you contextualize them, I think we are more than justified in taking this as a more or less straightforward representation of what's actually going on. As to the subcreative element, I can't think of a way to integrate the subcreative element into that particular answer, so I might push it over to Siobhan here.
Yeah, I would just say, I didn't include this, but I think Tolkien coins the term subcreation, and I think that he does so really trying to get at what MacDonald is doing with both the imagination being dependent and creative at the same time. So Tolkien's way of giving voice to that is to call it sub-creation, a creation that's always already under a prime creator and responsive to something. And I think you could largely argue that that is an extremely Catholic concept, right? That in some sense, at the very least, his worldview is fundamentally founded on a very Catholic understanding of the world and of creativity in that sense.
Okay, so we have 2 minutes, but there was a hand here, and then I saw a hand there, so I don't know how many more.
Thank you for your papers. You all talked about beauty and wonder, and I'm wondering if you might think briefly, any of you, how we might inculcate beauty and wonder in our classroom. I'll give you one quick example from my Inklings class I'm teaching this semester at Baylor. We try to behold particular passages. So when Sam and Frodo are lying on the mountainside, they can see Mount Doom, they're not there yet, and then Sam looks up at this one star that smites his heart with beauty. So are there other ways we can inculcate beauty and wonder in our classroom like that? Any of you? Yeah.
One thing I would say is to reverse this. This is would put this in the category of a tip, but I think it's actually very important. The encounter with a thing has to come before the dissection or analysis of it. And this is where I think it crosses, like, this beauty is not just about the arts, it's about everything. And so just one practical classroom tip is do not explain and then illustrate, but illustrate and then explore, with the explanation in the background when you need it. And I think what happens with students when you reverse that order is you have a primary wonder that's not yet contextualized with all the academic information you may or may not need to give them.
Okay, well, it is 10:15. I'm supposed to keep this very strict, so I'm so sorry. Yeah, and so I think, can we just give a hand of applause to all the speakers?